The beginning with the word, so I shall begin with a word. First word is a word of thanks to everybody who is taking part in this meeting and this symposium. And also thanks, of course, to the AA for hosting it. I really need to thank Manager, who has arranged this through successive postponements, some of which go back 8 years, and also Mark Cousins for his enthusiastic support. I have to say, however, that Mark cannot give his lecture at 5 o'clock. He will give it at 4, and therefore I will be at about 5:30. So the sequence in the last trio will be Mark Cousins, Robert Maxwell, and then myself, and a final discussion. This symposium reconvenes a symposium that we held 2 years ago at Liverpool John Moores University. And my original idea was to try to get as many people from that event into this one and then to enlarge it. That's not been quite as it worked out. I must especially thank, however, Ian Christie for his continuing commitment to this indefinitely postponed event, and Bob Maxwell, who was also at Liverpool. Unfortunately, our other participants there couldn't attend. Later on this afternoon, we'll be meeting Nigel Coates and John Maybury, who will take part. Now, the idea for this symposium goes back a long way to a proposal I made for a history and theory program 7 or 8 years ago. And that got postponed, but we finally held that course this year. And I was beginning to be increasingly aware that the study of film at the AA has a kind of historical record. The theme of the basic question of the symposium that I asked in Liverpool was, why should architects study the movies? Now, I've written on the first draft of this, why should they watch the movies? There's a big difference. I think we've all watched the movies over the years. Anybody never watched movies? But studying movies is quite a different thing altogether. And in fact, I reckon that serious study of movies and film, certainly by architects, only really gets going in the 1970s. And it's grown and grown since then. And this is largely through, I think, 2 stages of technical innovation. The first came in the 1970s with the arrival of video. The compact video camera and the VHS tape machine. And so this meant that for the first time, ordinary people with no access to film archives and Steenbeck machines and goodness knows what, were able to pay attention to the form and the structure of films in close detail, and to play them back and to begin to treat them as we've treated novels and other works of art over the years. The second stage begins in the 90s, and it is still unfolding around us, and that, of course, is the arrival of digital technology. And this has led to a new kind of initiative, namely the parallelism, intertwining, and convergence of techniques of visualization and rendering in both the architecture studio and the film studio, and indeed techniques of generating form and space. And Penelope Haralambidou's talk this morning, I think, will follow a great deal of those developments. They're still unfolding, and the consequences are still unknown, I think. But they're enormously important. I think it was David Green here some years ago raised the question, how is it that drawing became like watching TV? Well, it's more like making TV than watching TV. So those two technical developments, I think, have been enormously significant to the study of film amongst architects. I first encountered video in my first crits in this school with Diploma Unit 10 under Nigel Coates in the early 80s, came to a crit, and I was asked, first of all, to watch a series of videos, very much modeled on the video promos that the pop music industry was producing. And it's grown and grown since then. But I think two tutors at the AA have been particularly connected with film studies. The first was Bernard Tschumi, who led Diploma Unit 10 through the 70s and then handed it on to Nigel. And then since the 80s and until recently when he retired, was Pascal Schoening. And we had a Pascal Schoening celebration here last year. The interesting thing about those two tutors is that the approach to film, I think in some respects, paralleled a certain development within film history itself, because Bernard's great interest was in montage, and Pascal's was more in something like slow viewing, mise en scène. And in a way that parallels a certain movement in history in 20th century film. Now, I wrote a few notes, just a paragraph to introduce the Liverpool one, which I'll repeat here. Why should architects study the movies? What can they learn from them? What can film do that other kinds of document cannot? How can movies contribute anything special to our understanding of buildings and places, which after all stand still? A building may be recorded by plans, elevations, sections, or by projections such as axonometrics, perspectives, or photographs. Each of these present unique kinds of information and can convey particular qualities in their motifs. What special faculty can film bring to the representation of buildings and places? For which kinds of phenomena and qualities are movies especially apt? And how might architectural lessons in film be studied? So that was one starting point. Another you should have on your little program. So I want the symposium to examine how films offer means of spatial rendition of interest to architects. One is through motion, by montage, focal range, and camera mobility. A second way occurs in fiction films through the acting out of behavioural, affective, and psychological potentials that may be suppressed in actual buildings and places. Films, therefore, are an archive of evidence of how rooms, buildings, and places might be lived, either as truth 24 times a second, in Godard's terms, or as a ribbon of dreams, or both. And a third few lines of introduction come from the introductions to the course that I ran here last autumn. I begin with a quotation from Wittgenstein: "Ask of the use rather than of the meaning." Wittgenstein's advice about words might also be applied to things in architecture. But what is the use, say, of a balcony, a terrace, a vault, or an arcade? Do not their uses often exceed their builder's intentions? Designed to offer a view or a welcome to life, a balcony may enable concealment, escape, or suicide. Excess of potentials over plans has been an intrinsic condition of architecture from its outset, but none have grasped these possibilities more vividly than filmmakers. Is there a better illustration of the use of a threshold than the closing scene in John Ford's The Searchers, where John Wayne, bringing home a lost daughter to her family after years of searching, realizes that he cannot give up wandering, hesitates in the door's shadow, turns and walks back out into the desert. Is city edge estrangements anywhere bleaker than in certain scenes of Fellini's La Dolce Vita, Wells's The Trial, or Antonioni's L'Eclisse? Moreover, in each of such examples, space and place are revealed as they are in reality, that is, in movement and time. We might call them chronotopes, adapting Mikhail Bakhtin's term for the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships, artistically expressed in literature. Over a century, filmmakers have created thousands of such cinematic chronotopes. As a result, the Cinematheque of classic films now constitutes an archive of architectural phenomena unmatched by usual typologies of plans and models. So, I've tried to plan the day in such a way that we move in two parallel routes. One is chronologically, roughly from the beginnings of film, and the second is perhaps, you might say, in terms of contrasting the apparatus and the formal techniques of film with some of the thematic and affective aspects of film, which we'll come to more later in the afternoon. And so I'm going to begin by asking Richard Koch to open up with his researches into the relations between early projective and cinematic techniques and the representation of the image of the city. Richard teaches at Liverpool University, and I think use a little biography of everybody on the sheets that you should have in front of you. So please, Richard, I welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm just going to flip this on. I hope this comes up. Thank you. Perfect. Right. Right. So what I'm going to do today, perhaps give you just a very, very brief background of my research, the sort of things I do, and then I'll try to contextualize where my interest lies as an architect in film, and then rather swiftly dive into sort of the pre-cinematic, the sort of time that what happened at the very moment preceding when moving images became a huge success story for the last 220 years, and then bring also my interest into this symposium, which is this notion of immersion. I should say that I'm currently working on a book with the title "Immersed in the Image of the City," possibly inhabiting the image of the city. So this is going to be one of the things that we'll be exploring. In case you don't know, I'm running a research center in Liverpool. We are over 20 people working on different projects relating to film architecture, but also media productions. And perhaps I should mention here that Brian said there should be good reasons for architects to watch and study films. I actually produce films, and we produce films quite a lot, and that goes back, and I have to thank François for that, because I studied with François in Cambridge, and he really brought me into the world of cinema and film production. So in most recent years, we dived a lot into immersive productions, AR and VR, and in the sense, the book that I'm writing at the moment, which explores cinematic phenomena, focuses on this notion of immersion. What happens to us when we watch movies, and how can this be contextualized? I start with something I normally do when I give talks, and I'll just share you a little bit something about this corporeality of screen relations that we have. But then I give you a very short history about spatial immersion, and I'll end with a point that I would like to make around spectatorship and actorship. So this is a very simple observation when it comes to this notion of we observing something and we being encountering a screen. And the simple observation is a spatial one. I think back in the days when we watched movies in the cinema, the physical distance between us and the screen was 10, 15 meters, depending on where your seat were. And over time, with the innovation of television and then personal computers and mobile phones, and then things like Google Glasses and many other technological innovations, that sort of physical distance shrank very much. And I have been asking myself for some time now, what would be the next step? I mean, how close can we get to the screen? What is, what would be lying beyond the screen? And would it be possible that we step through that wall? Now, and then obviously there's the other phenomena, is that cinema changed phenomenally from being something that we publicly consumed in a dark space while we ourselves are motionless and will watch something in movement. And on one of my recent flights to Singapore or somewhere else, this is sort of a shot you can take there. We're all moving, and we're consuming moving images as individuals on individual screens, and the content is not necessarily the same. So this notion of cinematic spectatorship, I think, has undergone some interesting changes. And as an architect and as a designer, and as somebody who's very much interested in space and place and cities, I cannot help to transpose this notion of spectatorship to the way we see and engage with and inhabit cities. I think what we see is this notion of an urban spectatorship. I work myself in the sort of visitors economy, and this has become a very predominant theme. And here, this is taken, I think, in Shanghai on the Bund. You can see how we tend to reduce the image of the city from a three-dimensional entity back down to sort of this flat image. It's an activity we seemingly do enjoy. And I just love people watching the city and taking pictures and somehow capturing the moments. So this is a bit of the pretext, okay? Why is somebody like me, who is educated as an architect, actually interested in the image or moving images? Right, so for the book that I'm writing at the moment, I'm starting by trying to understand where's this idea coming from, that we are inhabiting a space and somehow being exposed to information, images, or let's reduce it down to sort of information bits. And that sort of led me to think a little bit about Cabinet of Curiosities from the 16th century. And here we have this famous etching from Ferrante Imperato, who was an apicary in Naples. And with the Cabinets of Curiosities, I'm sure you know, these were obviously collections of a geological nature, ethnographic, archaeological, religious, historic artifacts, religious artifacts, works of art, antiques. And these things spread around Europe. They had different terms. In Germany, they were called Wunderkammern. We also sometimes call them theaters of the world. And when I look at this, I see myself not too far away from when I'm wearing actually a VR headset, because I'm in the middle of a space and I can sort of look at and pick and choose, and sort of I'm totally immersed and surrounded by bits and pieces of information. Interesting here is as well is how the display cabinets are not just on the ground, so it really goes beyond the physical space. It's on the ceilings, on the wall, it's sort of a unified space. And this is obviously the same, can be found a stone throw away from here in the Stone Museum. And again, we have this idea of we being the spectators immersed in this narrative space and being surrounded by these bits and pieces of information. So I spend a lot of time to translate that into my own practical work. And I'm wondering, with the sort of digital immersive technologies that we do, I think we haven't fully grasped how to deal with things like VR. First of all, because we're missing the frame, which I sort of put here on the screen. In VR, you don't have a frame. The frame is a very important narrative device. So we're still trying to make sense of how we use this sort of completely immersive space, for instance, as a storytelling device. And it is, for me, really a question around our relationship between the material and the virtual information as well, not just virtual space, and our position as being either a spectator or an actor. And I'll come back to that perhaps a little bit later, but I think we often, we should not underestimate, let's put it this way, that we have a 120-year-long tradition of being spectators. We're not necessarily used to the idea that we are actors in a cinematic space. So I'll make a bit of a quantum leap jump here, when the sort of next important point in history when it comes to being immersed in a sort of a image-glad space are obviously Panoramas, and Robert Barker here in London again is a very important reference point. He and his son have built a Colosseum, a purpose-built structure to consume those images of and landscapes of battle scenes, naval scenes, but also the city here in London. And a little bit later also the Colosseum was sort of important reference point. And I think it's good when we look here a little bit what Benjamin said here, because for Benjamin, as it is for me, the panoramas is not just a way of seeing things, but it's a way of positioning ourselves in relationship to the city and making sense of the place that we are in. So it's almost like a container within a container. And it is really an expression of a new attitude to life. And as somebody who works at the moment a lot with image technologies, some of which are new and very immersive, I also question this idea that what we actually do here, are these sort of signifiers of a sort of a new attitude towards life? It's certainly, I think it is for me. And I'll jump again, because I only have 30 minutes, but I'll jump again as an important point in history, at least here for my research, and that is the World Exposition in Paris, the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1900. And here we are very close to the birth of cinema, obviously, 5 years after Lumiere Brothers showed the first films. And when I recently went to Paris and Lyon and digged into the archives, I was very, very surprised what I found and what level of innovation it took and what other sort of modes of operandi were being proposed at that time for the consumption of images, and some of them were moving images or at least involved movement. So most important reference point here is obviously the Lumiere Brothers. And I have to admit I'm really fond of the Lumiere Brothers because obviously there were other film pioneers in the UK and in Germany and elsewhere, but I think the Lumiere Brothers for me stand out because they are synonymous for using the medium of moving images to bring life from the seemingly mundane, the everyday life, street life scenes to a big screen. So that relationship between the city and the Lumiere Brothers is always something fascinated me. And Louis Lumiere recalled that for the Paris exhibition, he was first approached by Alfred Picard, the exposition's general secretary, and he proposed to conduct some sort of an experiment that would showcase the company's ability to produce greatly enlarged moving images for in relation to a relatively small device that could be seen simultaneously by thousands of people. So Louis Lumiere was obviously up for this because he had a great interest to publicize his invention. It was really in the formative years for his company. And they visited the Salle de the Galerie des Machines, actually. And the Galerie des Machines in Paris, which was built for the World's Expo the year before, was at the time the building that had the largest span of trusses with about 111 meters in the world. So it was an absolute phenomenally and huge building. So it was this iron frame structure a marvel, an architectural marvel, and Louis Lumiere was very much keen to push the boundaries. The building had a length of 428 meters, and he first envisioned to put the screen in the middle of the Galerie des Machines, and he thought that up to 20,000 people would be sitting on either side, and he would be projecting onto the screen from one side, and people would be consuming or seeing the images because it was a translucent screen on both sides. To the disappointment of Louis Lumiere, they built the in the center of the Galerie des Machines the salle des fêtes, a circular structure which we can see here for the World Expo exposition. So I had to change plans. So they built this screen, 24 by 30 meters, and the question was still, how do you bring enough light actually onto the screen, and how make you sure that the light reflects from the screen? Louis Lumiere wanted to use for this gigantic projection not the 35mm print, but a larger print. He thought they could develop a 45 by 60mm print, but that was not able to be done in the relatively short time for the planning. So the screening was executed with a normal 35mm print. They used electric projectors, 75 amp, quite big. I mean, it was a very big, I mean, normal projectors had around 40 amps. And when they did the first tests, they had a bit of a problem with the translucency. So Louis Lumiere had the idea to spray water onto the screen and asked the fire department to hose the screen down. And that apparently was so successful that he decided on the spot, we're going to do this every night. But obviously the fire department didn't like that idea to spray this thing down every night. So what they built was a concrete water tank, which they sunk into the ground, and a hoist. And every night they stored overnight the screen in the water tank, and in the evenings when they showed the films, they cranked it up and mounted up and showed the films. So the show from the Lumiere Brothers was around 25 minutes long. It was shown at every night during the World Expo. It showed about 15 different movies from an overall collection of 150 movies. Between 20 and 25,000 people attended every screening. And the audience again was situated on both sides. And over the course of the exhibition, they had about 1.4 million visitors. I mean, unbelievable audiences. I would say a huge success. Now, at the same time, there were other phenomenal ways to consume spatial scenes, and which were showcased at the World Expo, and some of which perhaps are lesser known, unless you're really, interested in that period. You probably wouldn't have known, but the Panoramas, for instance, Hugo Alesi's very fascinating and groundbreaking moving panorama. Hutamo points out that these were venues, the Panoramas, and I'm going to tell you in a moment about another one, which were based on vehicular amplification. So by that he meant that they were not simply created with some sort of an animated panoramic vision like the dioramas, but the auditorium had a moving platform, in this case a ship, and they were fully submerged into the action. A sort of an embodied multi-sensory and as such enhanced impression of reality, as Sonolis Barbosa described it. Alison Griffiths described this event as a hyper-realist spectacle conjoining the moving panorama with illusionist stage effects. And that's exactly what it was. It was a simulated sea voyage, that would be simulating a voyage on a steamboat that would ship along the Mediterranean coastline from Villefranche at the Côte d'Azur via Constantinople and to cities like Sousse in Tunisia, Naples and Venice. And while you might be saying, well, this has nothing to do with the city as such, these were obviously a naval scene, I think it has to do a lot with cities, because it was through an attraction like that that visitors could virtually travel to these places and see the silhouettes of these cities as sort of imprinted images of these cities that they would otherwise perhaps never been able to visit themselves. So the experience itself was around 30 minutes long. It was absolutely multisensory, and it had three key components. On the one hand, it had a panoramic canvas, the moving deck, and then there was also a theoretical experience, sort of enactment, and I'll describe that in a moment. But let's talk about the canvas here. A huge canvas, 750 meters long, altogether on both sides of the vessel, a height of 13 meters, rolled on 4 gigantic cylinders. The cylinders obviously were very, very heavy, and the problem was, how would you stretch the canvas and make it absolutely flat during the at the time when those images were unrolled from those barrels, because the weight would have changed, and they didn't want to sort of create any sort of folding effects. So those barrels were resting on water tanks for a frictionless motion, and there was a complicated hoist system that ensured, it was invented, and ensured that there was a flat and stretched image throughout the show. The deck itself was 50 meters long by 9 meters, again, quite sizable ship. It could hold, and there are different accounts in transcripts that I read, between 750 and 1,500 people actually at one go. It has an upper and a lower deck. And the ship was supported by a 16 feet long iron frame that was suspended on Cardian hydraulic suspension systems to simulate the rocking movement. The third layer of this immersive experience was the theoretical layer. And obviously there was daylight, nighttime simulation. There was a sea breeze that was simulated. Smells were induced into the auditorium. There were actors, there were performers, there were musicians. They had a fire drill. They had all sorts of things happening. People could write postcards and send it home to their friends. So very much an immersive experience. Sherry would approve. Now, I would like to briefly talk about a third, I still have some time actually, about a third spectacle at the World Expo, which coincided with the Lumiere projection, and that is the Cinerama by Raoul Grimoire-Sanson. Now, to spill the beans, that one didn't quite work out. It was a breathtaking idea and consumed a lot of money, but it had some problems. I'll come to that in a moment. But let's just enjoy the intention first. The intention was to have, again, a vehicular amplification. 200 people would be sitting in this basket. It was a simulated balloon ride over, in this case, Paris. Now, instead of having a painted backdrop, like with Barker's Panorama, the intention was here to have a 360-degree projection. So it was the first 360-degree projection on such a large scale. Who was Grimoire-Sanson? You might have not heard about him. Not much is written about him. There's very little knowledge about him. Ian, perhaps you would agree there's not much on him. I read his own sort of manuscript, and then you can sort of put bits and pieces together. But he was actually known in Paris for. He was the inventor of the so-called photoarchigraph, which was a 35mm projector which worked with the Edison perforation and which was in France very much the competitive product to the Lumiere cinematograph. I mentioned before that with this spectacle, the special thing, again, it's a non-stationary spectacle. It puts and embeds the mobile human body into a movement system and combines two dimensions, again, the space and the body here. Now, if you would imagine such an innovation today, we are talking about a very sophisticated flight simulator inside a massive structure, and you can look out the window. What was his objective? Why did he do that? It took him about 4 years to plan this event. Well, his objective, according to his own account, was to create a hyper-realistic sense of spatial and temporal reality. And that included, in this case, the illusion of virtually traveling up and down this sort of hot air balloon, visiting those wonderful places and spaces such as Paris, but also Brussels and London and a few other places around the world. The innovation of this spectacle is not necessarily the balloon and the mechanism of the vessel. The innovation lies in the fact that he attempted to project 360 degrees moving images. That requires you to first capture 360 degrees. None of this was very easy, and he built essentially a rack, which I'm going to show you in my next slide. But you see here in Madrid in a bull ring. It's a wooden rack, and I'll show you in a second, where he mounted 10 cameras together, each of them equipped with a 70mm print. He then synchronized them and started this device and filmed everything 360 degrees. It made a huge noise. In fact, in the recording in this bull ring here, people complained a lot. It almost started a riot, and it became so bad that apparently even the bull had sort of took notice of it, and it sort of created an interruption of the event. Well, I should again tell you again what was his motivation. I mentioned on the one hand that he wanted to create something ultra-realistic. The other thing that he said in his manuscript is that he was simply unsatisfied with the flat image of cinema. He was unsatisfied that people would be watching film on this relatively small screen. So on the one hand, we had Lumiere reacting to this by building this gigantic screen, and he reacted by building a 360-degree immersive experience. In terms of innovation, that is miles ahead of the Lumieres. The exhibition had a problem. And the problem can be anticipated here. The problem is that the projection room underneath got quite hot because you were running 10 projectors with 40 amps. You had 70mm nitrate films in this booth, and the fire department probably was still very much aware of the 1897 accident in the Bassin de la Charité, where 120 people died in a cinematic show. And after only a few screenings, where apparently even the projectionists inside that booth became very dizzy and almost unconscious, they decided that it would be too much of a fire hazard, and they closed it down. So it was an enormous disaster for Grimoire Sanson. It was a financial disaster. It ruined him, really. The innovation, however, I would like to point out, was gigantic. If you were to calculate, for instance, the resolution of the projected images here, we're talking about something like 320 megapixels per projector. Compare that with your best GoPro cameras with 4K. This was 320K per projector. So an enormous technological innovation at the time. And I couldn't help, and here I finally reveal the nice image. This is the original device, which can still be found in Paris, and you see here wonderful, this etching of the workers, how they mounted it together. In the middle you had this ring that synchronized the apparatus. I built and reconstructed this this device in 3D as well. It's absolutely fascinating and phenomenal. And when I look at this, and I cannot help to compare it to what's on the market at the moment. So on the right-hand side, you have GoPro's latest 360-degree recording device, vastly inferior of the device that Grimont-Sanson created. So, with this, I'll conclude with a few final remarks. I can't really claim to make a particular important final point, but I would like to just conclude by saying I really wonder about this notion of we immersing ourselves in moving images. What virtual reality is offering us today, I think, is not quite fully developed. We don't know how to use the medium very well. I would suggest that it is very much recommended that we should look into the history and into the material culture of immersiveness. In my case, I started to look into the cabinet curiosities and then later the 1900 Paris exhibition. And the other point that I would like to make, so it's a point about material and virtual, and I think the material is probably the more interesting one than the virtual, certainly from my research. And the last point I would like to do is to give us or raise the question about spectatorship and actorship. These devices and the way we use them at the moment, we still are spectators, like in the cinema. And I think we ought to think very carefully if we could not become actors in these systems. And I would urge the media as well as the architectural profession to think transdisciplinary and creatively and focus what those digital advancements would mean for us in terms of place and placemaking. I think I'm on time. Thank you.
My assumption here is that everyone attending this is coming from a different place, as it were. And in my experience, a lot of people who are very much involved in film know remarkably little about the visual side of film. One of the problems with film studies is that it is focused exclusively on literary issues and very little on production design. Most of what we spend our time doing in the cinema is watching what the art department has put there. But if you read the literature of film studies, you would never guess this. Very little has been written about production design. So I made it my mission about 10 or 12 years ago to try to find out more about the history of production design and also to put this in front of people who have different kinds of involvement with film. I've done several books, and I've talked about it at a variety of different places and institutions. What you're going to see this morning is drawn from a series of classes I gave last year in Chile, at the University of Valparaiso, as a joint offering between the School of Architecture, as it happens, and the Department of Film Studies. And it's really, if you like, production design for beginners. So I hope nobody feels insulted by this. If there are any production designers here, you may leave now and come back in 50 minutes. But I do feel that it's an area where really quite simple and basic things haven't been brought together in a convenient way, and that's what I'm going to try and do. Now, you may recognize that this is a relatively recent film. Its sequel has just come out. Anybody recognize it? No. This is Doctor Strange. 2 frames from it. And what films do, particular genres of film do, hyperbolically, of course, is to create imagined and often imaginary spaces. And we're not normally encouraged to think about the elements that make up these spaces. But if we do, we discover that, of course, they're hybrid spaces, they're synthetic spaces, which are welded together from elements of reality, elements of constructed reality, the studio, found reality in various locations, which are increasingly, of course, cemented together by means of CGI. A continuation, really, of the techniques that Richard was talking about earlier. And I'm going to look at the development of those techniques. But I'm interested also just momentarily in the strangeness of, no pun intended, the strangeness of these hybrid spaces that are created. That bottom left picture was taken actually in the foothills of the Andes at the top of Chile. And there's something quite strange about seeing Doctor Strange shown in a neighborhood cinema in Arica, with the Andes appearing behind. Because if you look at the construction of the world of Doctor Strange, we find that it's based on some location shooting in Nepal, some use of found locations in the city of London, some studio work done in a London film studio, and some pieces of historic reality, Exeter College Chapel, which is a favorite venue used by production designers when they want something that's truly Gothic. It's cheaper to borrow the chapel than it is to build it. So this is a typical mix, if you like. We are not, of course, as spectators, encouraged to probe it or even to think about its components, because we're nowhere when we're watching it. We're everywhere and nowhere, and we're meant to be guided by our sense of the trajectory of the film's story and characters. Okay, where does this all come from? Well, an important thing to bear in mind, of course, is that it doesn't begin with cinema. And I think one of the really important lessons that I've learned, and I'd like to pass on to you, is the falsity of the great 1895 threshold, or 1896, depending how you want to look at it. This is an entirely bogus construction, which has been promulgated, especially by film enthusiasts, for the last 100-odd years. There is nothing magical about 1895 or 1896, nothing whatsoever. Most of what you could see on screen at that moment had already been seen. The method of combining the elements, as Richard showed, I think, very, very clearly, was new to a certain extent. Some of it worked, and some of it didn't. Much of it didn't, in fact. But I think it's worth reminding, especially film people, that, of course, there's a long history of constructing imagined spaces by theatrical and painterly means. The history of painting, for at least 500 years before cinema, had involved constructing sets and using these as the basis for paintings. We can see that in late Victorian painting, for instance. Luc Feuillet's very famous picture, which hangs in many hospitals, built a complete set. He could, a few years later, have actually made a film in the set that he built. But that was true even in the 400 years before. Caravaggio built sets for many of his pictures too. And in fact, here we have which is rare. We have an actual illustration published at the time, the bottom right there, showing Fielders at work with the set that he built in his studio to produce the painting above. We also see something very interesting here in another illustration by Fielders, an extraordinary illustration in which he looks forward to something that would exist in cinema much later. He, after the death of Dickens, he imagines, as it were, the world of Dickens by showing an empty space and invites the spectators to people that space with their knowledge of the creations of Dickens. And I think there's some interesting lessons to be learned from looking particularly at 19th century painting in spectatorship. Our sense of space and narrative has been so conditioned by cinema that we are badly placed to read 19th century paintings. We come too late, as it were. Our imagination has been cinematized. But for a spectator of 1886, it would have been a completely different experience to read a painting like Holman Hunt's Lady of Shalott. It would be possible to see the narrative of the poem in the painting, to expand the sense of narrative. We are likely to walk past it and see merely a flat image because we have been shaped by our experience of cinema. So I think that there are some important lessons here about historical spectatorship, the kind of thing that Michael Baxendale talked about in his work on spectatorship at different phases in the history of the painted image. The period I, as he called it. We have a period I which is unavoidably affected by the last 120 years of moving image consumption. So that, for instance, and this is just a spot check here, this is another picture by Hunt, The Awakening Conscience, which certainly invites some interpretation. Most people who would look at this picture and are aware of its title would say, well, whose conscience? Why is it awakening? What's happening? It's a painting which, by the combination of title and image, more or less pushes us into making some interpretation, some assessment of what's happening. So it belongs to the climax of narrativized painting. And here, for instance, is Ruskin, who, of course, had a very acute eye, born of his time for reading such pictures. Here is Ruskin's account of the picture as he sees it. Not an object in the room, but it becomes tragic if read rightly. So Ruskin is, as he did, of course, so often giving us lessons in reading pictures. And in fact, it's an illicit tryst going on in a rendezvous house where lovers would take their mistresses. And Holman Hunt went to enormous trouble to hire a location, to dress it, and to paint it in such a way that the narrative is, as it were, thrust upon us through the accumulation of detail. So I offer this just as an example of reading spaces that would have been perfectly legible to their intended contemporary audiences, but which are sometimes inaccessible to us unless we work hard at it. Now, I have to add to Richard's account of the Lumieres. I would say this, having just written a book about Robert Paul, that Robert Paul created cinema, the Lumieres created moving pictures. Don't believe a word of what the French say. The Lumieres removed themselves from what they regarded as cinema very early on, very shortly after 1900, in fact, and played no part in the development of narrative film. They did introduce moving pictures to the world, which was very important, but it was actually Robert Paul who created most of the narrative strategies that would become cinema over the next 10 years. And to do this, he built a studio. something which the Lumieres, of course, never felt the need to do, because they were essentially filming chunks of reality, mostly around Lyon, where they were based. But Paul saw the need to build a studio, and he built one in Muswell Hill in North London in 1898. We don't have a picture of the actual studio. This is a pre-studio that he built, while the main one was under construction on the right. This is historically the first film studio, and it's exactly parallel to Méliès' better-known studio in Montreuil, in the outskirts of Paris. Méliès was an early customer of Robert Paul's. He got his equipment from him. We could say quite a lot about what this is built to do in terms of scenic possibilities. But here we can, I'm going to move quickly here, here we can see some of the examples of the early films made in 1900, 1901 by Robert Paul on the Muswell Hill studio stage. Essentially, it's a matter of flats, of course, but there is some use of depth, some use of basic theatrical techniques, and there is the early use, in the top left-hand image, of a matte technique. So in other words, there's a central dark area into which a superimposed image is introduced, which moves independently of the framing set. So here we can see this is the Haunted Curiosity Shop of 1900, we can see Paul taking the first steps towards that phantasmagoric effect, which we see in Doctor Strange and all most contemporary films. So it has a very long history. And here we have another example from the Brighton School of Filmmaking in the early 1900s, George Albert Smith, who built a studio. And here we do have an overall shot of what the studio looked like, much simpler studio for making films like Mary Jane's Mishap, which the unfortunate Mary Jane is shot through a chimney when she puts paraffin on the fire. This is the kind of film which put Britain in the forefront of film development for about 5 years, until it started to move backwards and ceased to be in the forefront. And around this same time, 1901, 1905 or so, for 5 or so years, the arrowhead of progress shifted to Paris. It hadn't been in Paris before, by the way, but Georges Méliès, in his studio at Montreuil, did an enormous amount to create the resources of a studio with very elaborate scenic work. And here you've got some images, top there, top left, middle left, of Méliès' studio at work building these extraordinary sets that Méliès used. And that, what you have at the bottom left there, is the reconstruction of Méliès' studio that was made for Scorsese's Hugo, which was made at Shepperton. So a complete reconstruction of the Méliès studio was made, which you can see in Scorsese's film. This was a very short period. Méliès is using the full resources of his glass-topped studio with multiple superimpositions and elaborate scenography, really successfully between about 1901, 1902 and about 1906-07. By about 1907, he is very definitely old-fashioned. And although he continues in business until 1912, he's moving backwards, as it were, as progress is coming from different directions. So I would say that production design in the kind of modern sense of the word begins about 1907, at the point at which Méliès becomes already part of the prehistory of cinema, the primitive history of cinema, as indeed does Robert Paul. There's the reconstruction of Méliès' setup during Hugo, where Scorsese had the, I think, brilliant idea of using 3D and color, of course, to recreate that sense of the marvelous, what the surrealists called the marvelous, which struck the first spectators of Méliès's work. So Scorsese reinvented it by, as it were, adding digital 3D. It's worth also, just as a footnote to Richard's presentation, to his last point about depth, Louis Lumiere was always convinced that cinema should be stereoscopic. He was absolutely determined. He was devastated to discover that projecting 3D was not very easy. And he continued working on it. Even though he got out of cinema per se, he actually cracked the problem of projecting stereoscopic film in 1935-36, proudly displayed it 35 years after the event. So he was a true believer that indeed cinema should be stereoscopic. So this is the beginnings of commercial film production on a mega scale. It's the Pathé studio at Montreuil, which was later taken over by a Russian company, the Albatross company that left Russia in 1917. So it's a much bigger glass-topped studio, which makes possible a wide range of scenic constructions. And this is why I suggest that 1907, 1908 marks a kind of turning point, because this is the beginning of the creation of elaborately historical sets. It's a convenient marker, partly because the company that was set up to produce the film was called Film d'Art. It went bust in less than a year. There wasn't much of a market for art films, but the image of the Film d'Art continued strongly. And in fact, Pathé quickly bought up the company and promulgated the brand through its international network, so that film d'art were produced everywhere that Pathé had a branch, all over the world. So what you have at the bottom there is a frame from the assassination of the Duc de Guise, from the company's first production. And what you have is De la Roche's famous painting, which, as it were, every school child would have known, widely reproduced. It's one of those moments in French history which I guess every French school child knows of. Yes. No British school child or adult has ever heard of. What I'm offering here, just very simply, is a very simple object lesson in the creation of filmic space as against painterly space. Basically, the De la Roche painting has more space in it. So what the directors and the designers of the assassination film do is they compress it. They also do things with depth, filmic things with depth, through the movement of bodies in space. It's an extremely cleverly and well-constructed film. It's still absolutely stunning. It has a score by Camille Saint-Saëns, the first score by a major composer, and it really works. There's a moment in it when you feel that you're watching something by Scorsese. It's got a real sort of Goodfellas feel about it. But the important lesson here is that it was worth creating historicized spaces. A lot of time and trouble and expense was used on the sets, the furnishings, the dressing, and the costume for this film. So at this point, the lesson is learned that expenditure on these elements pays off. And cinema then enters a very interesting period, which is getting more and more attention just in recent years. It was ignored for a very long time, and it's the classical era. It's a continuation of the film d'art movement, but basically from 1908 onwards, Italian production begins to command a world audience. Italy had produced nothing in the way of film up to this point. First 10 years, pretty much blank. Suddenly, a group of companies in Milan, Rome, Turin, start to make impressive films set in the ancient world. They realize that their real asset is a sort of knowledge, a feel for the ancient world, an ability to produce props and costumes. And so these films beginning with The Last Days of Pompeii by Ambrosio in 1908, become immensely valuable. These are the films that begin to be sold for large amounts of money. They begin to occupy space on the screen. The second version of The Last Days of Pompeii, which was made in 1913, opened the West End cinema here in London. It's where the Rialto is at the moment. And there are ads in the paper saying, schoolmasters, bring your children to see this edifying film. Prices range from half a guinea downwards. Half a guinea to watch a film in 1913. That was a huge amount of money. This was a very elaborate production. Spectators were guaranteed that what they were seeing was a faithful recreation of the ancient world. And in a sense, they were. The uncredited art director, or art inspiration for this period of work, of course, was Alma Tadema. We had a wonderful exhibition here in London of Alma Tadema last year. We had a conference. Part of the conference was looking at the interplay between Alma Tadema and the development of representation of the classical world in cinema. So we see Alma Tadema's very, very detailed paintings based on his own architectural excursions to Italy, to Greece, being fed into cinema during this period from 1908 to about 1915. Here you can see it's not just Alma Tadema. Gérôme, of course, is even more influential in certain areas. If you go to the Musée d'Orsay and look at, they have a rotating display of Gérômes, you'll see a lot of the models for this period. This is the closest match. The most successful ancient world film of 1913 was Quo Vadis, and it's an absolute, it's transcribed from Gérôme's famous painting of thumbs up. Thumbs down? Thumbs down. Now, there was a time when every book on the history of cinema used to contain this lower image. They still do, to some extent, but not quite so common. It's one of the most reproduced of all early film stills. It's probably the earliest film still that is reproduced absolutely everywhere, because it's a stunning image, and it exists in high definition, so you can reproduce it very successfully. It's the set for the Babylonian episode of Griffith's second mega film, After Birth of a Nation, Intolerance. The really strange thing is that nobody, until very recent times, ever seems to have wondered who designed it, who built it. They just took it for granted. I mean, anybody looking at this extraordinary set can see that this was a major feat of imagination, of design, and of construction. But it never seemed to cross anyone's mind. It just happened. How? How did it happen? Well, now we know that Walter Hall, who was one of the completely unsung pioneer art directors who worked with Griffith, designed it, and here we have one of his drawings for it. And we can see that the whole design process is, of course, already in existence, as it had been in Italy. And yet we know almost nothing about who designed those Italian spectacles. No names, no drawings, no nothing. This is what I mean about the absence of curiosity on the part of film scholars who have not really paid much attention to these matters. And so in many ways it's too late to discover the incunabula that would give us the insight. If you go to LA today and go to the big shopping center that has the Kodak Theater, you will see a couple of elephants sculpted. Why? Because they're a tribute to this set. There's a sort of subliminal awareness in LA that this was once the setting for extraordinary structures like this. And this set, in fact, hung around for about a year before it gradually fell apart. And the Taviani brothers made a film about the Italian craftsmen who were brought to Hollywood who worked on the making of the film. So there is a kind of lineage that runs all the way from the people who made the Italian spectacle films who were then imported to work on doing likewise in America, because Griffith's inspiration for Intolerance was the Italian spectacle films. Enter lighting. everything we've looked at so far has been done with essentially daylight. Glass-topped studios, mirrors, reflectors to some extent, but essentially daylight. The arrival of artificial light in filmmaking happens about 1915. And of course, it's a major, this is another absolute threshold, watermark. Klieg lighting, as it became known, high-intensity electric lighting, was a new development. It was risky. It had the same sort of risks that poor old Grandma Sanson suffered from. It was hot. It was not good for your eyes. Actors began to suffer from being under the lights. But the results were sensational. And one man, more than anybody else, mastered filmic lighting very quickly, just in the space of 1 year, Cecil B. DeMille, who made 14 films in 1915. And all of the ones that survive are masterpieces. They're brilliant. He exploited the possibilities for chiaroscuro lighting, for instance, in The Cheat, you can see here, the use of shadows as background to the foreground. That's Carmen up at the top, which is combines exteriors using Californian landscape with studio work. The Cheat is very much a studio film. The next obvious turning point, of course, is the development of the dark studio, which is implicit, really, in the introduction of lighting. Once you introduce lighting, you have the possibility of creating a dark studio. So film studios go from being all light, capturing as much light as possible, to becoming dark boxes. And this shift is closely associated with the German studios after World War I. The reconstruction of the German film industry, which was done by state direction in 1919, had a lot of benefits. And one of them was it created new studios in Berlin and in Munich and mainly. And one of the first products of the dark studio was Caligari, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, in 1919. A film which was made entirely with painted sets, painted and constructed sets. Very controversial, divided opinion in the film world massively between those who said this is the future of cinema and those who rejected it as being totally false and fake. But it wasn't only happening in Germany. At exactly the same time, Russian studios were experimenting with the possibility of, again, the dark studio effect. And a lesser known, but I think rather interesting film, which certainly was influential when people got to see it, was Aelita, made in the Soviet studios in 1924, which has some extremely elaborate scenic effects, as well as a lot of exterior work done by Jaco Protezzano. And if you look at the actual design credits, you find that the settings were done by Rabinovich, who was a designer for one of the Moscow theaters. The costumes were by the painter Alexander Exter, and the interplay of costume and decor is extraordinary in Aelita. This is the point, same year, at which modernist design and cinema briefly come into direct contact. Marcel L'Herbier's film L'Inhumaine is a modernist fairy tale with some very, very interesting design credits. Mallet Stevens, the very prominent, very fashionable architect, designed the main structures. A whole gallery of young modernist artists, filmmakers, designers contributed to it, and Léger, I suppose, was the most celebrated figure who contributes to it as well. Léger was interested in film, and of course made one film, Ballet Mécanique, in 1924-25, or at least he collaborated on it. And you can see if you set Ballet Mécanique with the episodes in it that are most obviously due to Léger and his particular interests, alongside this, which is a very stiff and rather stodgy and ultimately very boring film, the stills will look much better than the film. You can see part of the problem. The problem is that what film needs is a more fluent integration of these elements, not a stopping in awe in front of modernist design. So this film is important, I think, because it sort of shows what you shouldn't do, however attractive the idea is of a collaboration between artists, modernist artists, and cinema. As I say, the stills look much better than the film. Cavalcanti and Otonvara worked as part of the design team on L'Inhumaine, and this is some of their work. It's stunning when seen as an image in passing, but it's not so successful actually on screen. And that brings us to the other great landmark, much better known, made 2 years later in the Berlin studio in Babelsberg, Metropolis. We know an enormous amount about Metropolis now because this is a film which has undergone an extraordinary process of rebirth and discovery. Some of these images come from the Cinémathèque Française's exhibition of 3 years ago, a spectacular exhibition which laid out a lot of the artwork which has survived from the making of Metropolis. It's probably worth saying that Metropolis was a notable failure when it first appeared. It was laughed off the screen in most countries, considered absurd, much too long, totally uninteresting, cut to ribbons, and quietly forgotten about. Something strange happened, I think, in the post-World War II world, and people started to show an interest in it. And the few tattered examples of it were brought together, and there's been a process of restoration underway over a number of years, which has now yielded more or less the complete film from bits and pieces found in cupboards, mainly in South America. So it's a film, and there's an important lesson, I think, in this. This is a film which was, in some senses, of its time, 1926, but in many respects was not aimed realistically at what audiences were interested in 1926 and 27 and 28. It failed to ignite any recognition on the part of audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. It bankrupted the production company. But its time came later. And of course, films, this is a recurrent phenomenon, films which have been often rejected when they first appear can be rediscovered and can be elaborated. It's not always the case, but there are many interesting long-range processes of discovery, appreciation, reappropriation, which go on, I think. We shouldn't see it as a simple linear progression. It never is, of course. So Metropolis, to us, stands as a kind of beacon for a kind of, another kind of modernist design, which draws upon many, many aspects of German expressionist architecture, etc. We can spot all the references and things that went into it. And it's very much an art department piece of work. It's different from L'Inhumaine, where artists contributed their components. In this case, it was essentially the art department. Who knows who Erich Kettelhut? He doesn't figure in the larger history of design and architecture, but he was the man who brought it all together. So the art department as a force for integration and for shaping elements into a coherent vision becomes very important in cinema from this point onwards. And here is an example of the art department triumphant. The English equivalent of Metropolis, very much inspired by Metropolis, in fact, a film based on H.G. Wells's novel, The Shape of Things to Come, where Alexander Korda unwisely promised to allow Wells to write the script, not a good idea, and brought together an amazing array, another selection of amazing talents to work on the design of the futuristic parts of things to come. Léger again worked on it. All his designs were chucked out, as far as we know. There is a photo of him on the set, but nothing of his appears to survive in the film. Moholy-Nagy also worked on it, but again, it's very difficult to see anything precisely his in it. Essentially, the art department, supervised by Vincent Korda, one of the great art directors, the great production designers, Alexander Korda's brother, synthesized these elements into a relatively coherent vision. And what we see here is some of the most, again, very spectacular elements, which often feature as stills from what Korda managed to do. The film was directed by William Cameron, well, sort of directed by William Cameron Menzies, an American art director who was brought in to weld together the different elements of the film. And of course, William Cameron Menzies would be the first art director to receive the title production designer for his work on Gone with the Wind. So this kind of marks the beginning of the era of production design, the recognition that films need a coherent design vision which will bring together their elements. And I just wanted to end with a little flash forward, because the history of production design, there are many histories of production design, obviously, it tends to follow a predictable path. If I were to go on in the vein that I've been going on, we would be in deep Hollywood during the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and then we would look at, aspects of production design in Europe, etc. But we probably wouldn't say much about, for instance, the work of Tarkovsky. Now, why would we not do that? Were there not production designers continuing to work in Soviet cinema through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s? Yes, of course there were. Do we know their names? No. Are they recognized? No. Our attention span tends to be quite focused on those who have entered the annals of design history. And it's a very American story from the 1930s onwards. So part of the problem is to open it up a little bit. We also tend to attribute superhuman powers to directors. And this is a recurrent vice. What did Tarkovsky have to do with the construction of this extraordinary set? Very little. Very little indeed. He knew what he wanted, certainly, and to some extent what he could get. But I think we have to recognize that film is a collaborative process. And we do still, I think, suffer from attributing too much vision to directors. Some directors are visual, many are not. Some directors are able to influence the art department and to inspire them. In many cases, it's the other way around. The art department inspires the director and says, it can be like this, it can be like this, you choose. And that's a more common process, a much more common process. So I think the habit that people in film history and film studies have of attributing films to directors is actually quite dangerous and really cuts us off from trying to understand the processes that go into creating an extraordinary environment like the space station of Solaris, which is a fascinating concept. Because this is an example of cinema, improbably Soviet cinema, late Soviet cinema, giving us a vision of the future in space. And the one thing I would just say about that is that there's, again, a back history to this. It's not just that the film Aelita was set in space in 1924, which it was to some extent. It actually goes deep down into the roots of late Russian philosophy and mysticism, the vision of Fyodorov, the philosopher Fyodorov, the rocket pioneer Tsiolkovsky. Some of you, I'm sure many people here saw the Cosmonauts exhibition at the Science Museum a few years ago, which actually delved back into the roots of Russian fascination with space travel. Absolutely fascinating, beautifully presented, and really took us back to why Soviet cinema should have invested so heavily in making this film. Tarkovsky himself didn't like the film. He said it was too science fiction. He thought it was the least successful of all his films because there was too much science fiction in it. But still, we can take from it a different kind of reading. And what's interesting about the film, of course, is the way that it sets up this extraordinary dialectic between an idealized vision of life in space and an idealized vision of life on Earth. This is a sort of Edenic Earth, which is set in contrast to the extraordinary vision of a very sanitized, very comfortable, very livable in version of space. It's a fascinating film, I think, read against that ideological background, but we don't tend to think too much. If you look at all the many books on Tarkovsky, and believe me, there are a lot of books on Tarkovsky, none of them ever talk about the design, and very few talk about even the visual world of his films. And yet, of course, it's Tarkovsky who is one of the most influential of all filmmakers, I would suggest, on architects, in my experience, on designers of all kinds. I've met many, many designers who will immediately say that Tarkovsky is their first influence. Well, they're taking things from him, but these are not the things that film scholars have talked about. They're talking about the textures, the spaces he creates in films like Stalker and so forth. So there's a bit of a mismatch here, and I suppose what I'm advocating is that we should actually learn to see cinema as a visual medium. It's not too late. Not entirely too late. That's my contribution to Learning on the Job, a book about John Box, which I did some years ago. That's a very interesting book. A little out of date, perhaps, now, by the Afron's book, Sets in Motion, which I think is one of the few really good books about the history of production design that really raises interesting questions about how films construct worlds, how filmmakers construct worlds on screen. And it produces a very interesting set of concepts for understanding and analyzing the settings of films, a 5-level model, which the Afrons proposed, which I find quite useful. And that's the most recent book that's come out, Jane Barnwell's book, Production Design for Screen, just out last year, which is a very good book indeed by a working production designer that really takes one through the design process and the challenges and the interpretations that designers bring to their work for a whole range of films, which I would recommend as a recent contribution to the field. Thank you.
So, thank you, Brian. Thank you for inviting me, and many thanks to the previous presenters. And I'm also really looking forward to the rest of the event. It sounds as a really interesting opportunity to get all of us together to talk about the relationship between film and architecture. And as you were saying, Brian, you're talking about the reasons why architects should study the movies, but I'm actually really interested in going perhaps further than that and saying that architects perhaps should start making movies, and that somehow these worlds are beginning to coincide slightly. So through in my talk today, I will talk a little bit more about what I've been looking at in terms of my research, the essay film, but then I will jump into work that I'm doing with Unit 24 at the Bartlett, where we're using this opportunity to make films, to think architecture from a point of view that introduces an element of time. So architecture and film belong to traditionally discrete disciplines, but have always shared a mutual attraction. For instance, Wim Wenders suggests that both architects and filmmakers have the same obsessions with a sense of place. However, Wenders warns that a certain modesty is required from filmmakers when they compare themselves to architects, because buildings are very real, while films just form people's visions and dreams. But then he immediately asks, or am I wrong? I would like to suggest that although Wenders is right, I see forming of people's visions and dreams as a significant spatial practice, which, while admittedly not material, is still very real. I believe film has the ability of making space, a space that we collectively occupy in our imagination, and the significance of which, for architecture, we tend to overlook. However, the focus of my talk is not the relationship between architecture and film in general, but the specific genre, whose origins coincide with the beginning of the cinema that we saw earlier today, which was really interesting, 2 talks, and which is notoriously difficult to define, the essay film. Coined by the German artist and filmmaker Hans Richter in the 1940s, the term essay film describes an intimate, elusive, and idiosyncratic genre at the margins between fiction and documentary. For Richter, rather than just portraying the external world, what is out there, the essay film makes visible on the screen the hidden world of thoughts and ideas, the imagination. Often combining moving images with spoken or written text, it produces complex thought reflections that are not necessarily bound to reality, but can also be contradictory, irrational, and fantastical. The visual and verbal are deeply intertwined in the essay film. Timothy Corrigan insists that more than a new cinematic genre, it is a direct continuation of the tradition of the literary essay, following from Montaigne through Borges, Huxley, and Barthes. For Corrigan, the literary essayist legacy is what formulates the genre's distinctive terms. It stretches between an exaggerated representation of the self in language and in image, and an experiential world acquired through the discourse of thinking out loud. As Jean-Luc Godard has suggested, the essay film is form that thinks. Laura Scaroli, in her recent book, How the Essay Film Thinks, discusses the essay film as future philosophy, as contrarian, political cinema, whose argumentation engages us in a space beyond the verbal. Chris Marker is widely considered as the quintessential film essayist. Most of his work, including the cult films La Jetée and Sans Soleil, a selection of scenes we see playing now, use film to meditate on the human condition. As part of my recent research, I have identified a subgenre, essay films that more specifically focus on urban or architectural subject matter, which I have called architectural essay films. More specifically, I see the architectural essay film not only as a space to think architecture, but also as space making. Questioning and probing, but also deeply infatuated by the cities and buildings they portray, analyze, and reflect upon, films belonging to this subcategory are wide-ranging historically and geographically. And to draw some significant traits that I find in the architectural essay film, I will now present a series of examples. One of the first examples of the architectural essay film is Giga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera from 1929. Widely acknowledged as an archetype essay film in general, Vertov's film is a recording of citizens interacting with the machinery of modern life at work and at play from dawn till dusk in the Soviet Union. By exposing remote parts of the country to each other, the film was seen as promoting the goals of the revolution. Vertov believed that the camera, what he called the kino eye, was able to capture fragments of reality, which, when organized together through montage, showed a deeper truth that was invisible to the naked eye. Working with a Marxist ideology and through splicing together footage from different cities, such as Moscow, Kiev, and Odessa, Vertov strove to propose a composite city, a composite futuristic city, electrified by the machine vision of the kino eye. So an important trait of the architectural essay film that I would like to point out is related to Vertov's conviction of the film's capacity for space making. By juxtaposing fragments of spaces in time, the filmmaker is able to propose new spatial construct, a new city, as perhaps both the foundation and the vessel for a new ideology. Another typical example of the architectural essay film, this time focusing on a single public building, is Toute la mémoire du monde by Alain Resnais. Accompanied by Remo Forlani's commentary, Resnais's camera work caresses the skin of the old Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. The film is an essay on the human need to preserve knowledge that uses the building as an underlying structure. Here, I'm interested in how the theme of beautifully preserving knowledge is organized on a journey through the building, from basement to main reading room, following the arrival of a new book. The promenade through the edifice specializes the exploration of an idea, and each space operates as a chapter in Forlani's poetic essay. So the second trait that I would like to point to is film's ability to graft meaning onto architectural form, which I see connected to the ancient technique of the art of memory, perhaps, as discussed by Francis Yates. There can be no discussion of the architectural essay film without mention of Patrick Keeler, a trained architect turned film director. In the following fragment from London, I would like to draw attention to the interstitial space created between the film sequences and the semi-fictional text narrated by Paul Scofield that Paul Newland calls a phonotope.
The next morning, we walked to Hammersmith and rested outside the house of William Morris. We remembered what we used to think of as the future: sophisticated engineering, low consumption, renewable energy, public transport. But just now, London is all waste, without a future. Its public spaces either void or the stage sets for spectacles of 19th century reaction, endlessly reenacted for television. Most of the traffic on the river now, said Robinson, is rubbish on its way to landfill sites in Essex. 500,000 tons a year from the depots at Battersea and Wandsworth Bridge. Sometimes, he said, at Battersea Reach, where trains that carry spent uranium cross the river at night, sometimes I see the whole city as a monument to Rambo.
So according to Newland, a phonotope is a time space where the voice develops a temporal dialogue between the visual and the verbal. The voiceover is a technique often used by essayist directors where the often unreliable narrator's musings can contradict or confuse the imagery of the film, creating a space in between. Los Angeles Plays Itself by Tom Anderson is another city reflection that this time combines fragments of existing films. In this sequence, Anderson shows how Hollywood movies have almost systematically denigrated the modernist residential architectural heritage, one of the glories of Los Angeles, by casting many of the celebrated houses as the residences of movie villains, the character directly projected on the architecture. Anderson juxtaposes the real city with the movie-making industry that gave birth to it. The boundary between everyday life and collective fiction starts to melt. The city that he exposes is haunted by the specter of its ingrained cinematic image, which redoubles and mythologizes, but also confuses and degrades its host. Los Angeles versus LA. Anderson's harnessing of film to make his own is an essayist trait that originates in the literary essayist tradition. Wenders works from a sense of place. He strongly believes that places have stories to tell. If you are in a place for a while, he says, and if you are able to listen, you will hear the place's story. In Cathedrals of Culture, Wenders invited 6 directors to portray a different building each. The buildings take the role of the main protagonist and directly speak to the audience. The films give a voice to the buildings and explore the question of how architecture communicates with the users. This personification, however, also exemplifies a sense of empathy, where the filmmaker identifies with the architecture that he reconstructs through the camera. Living architectures, Ila Becker and Louise Lemoine, whose back catalogue has been recently bought by MoMA, are also interested in the voice of the building. The films put into question the fascination with the picture and preconceived ideas of perfection, virtuosity, and infallibility in order to demonstrate the vitality, fragility, and vulnerable beauty of architecture as recounted and witnessed by people who actually live in, use, or maintain the spaces. And here we see the cleaner in Rem Koolhaas's Bordeaux house. Rather than talking about architecture, their intention is to let architecture talk to us from an inner point of view, both personal and subjective. Finally, as a bridge to the next part of my talk, I would like to mention another celebrated essayist director, Harun Farocki. Farocki's work explores how image-making technologies can be used to shape public perception. His films often tackle politically charged topics, from the use of napalm by the US in the Vietnam War to video games and conflict simulation. His important work is too varied to try to analyze here, but I'm interested in a particular series of films that he made just before his death in 2014. The films, Parallel 1 to 4, study the digital architecture of video games, pondering on the future of the moving image and cinema. Describing his film in an interview, he says, I'm just researching these strange new images, which are somehow on the verge of competing with and defeating, finally, the cinematographic, photographic image. So the era of reproduction seems to be over, more or less, and the era of construction of a new world seems to be somehow on the horizon. And he quickly corrects himself, or not on the horizon, it's already here. So the digital has allowed groundbreaking changes in the way that architecture is drawn and in the way that films are made, bringing the two disciplines closer than ever before. Drawn architectural form, the domain of the architect, and the camera, together with lighting, scripting, and editing, the domain of the film director, have merged into compatible digital platforms. What Farocki calls the era of construction, facilitated by digital technology, allows for the potential transformation of the architectural essay film for an obscure genre into a propositional technique in architecture. To cast light on what this might mean, I will now move to the work that we do up the road from here at the Bartlett School of Architecture with Unit 24. Some of the students are here, which I coordinate with Michael Tite. Unit 24 is a research laboratory that harnesses the digital convergence between film and architecture. Combining digital filmmaking with architectural proposition, our cinematic musings bridge theory with practice and design with commentary. By sculpting time and foregrounding empathy, the films we produce aim to unlock the storytelling, political, and philosophical subconscious of architectural design. Embracing heresy and soliloquy, the projects are perhaps primarily essays, though, descending canonical disciplines and defying categorization as either film or architecture. I will discuss a series of projects around selected keywords: architecture, cinema, drawing, allegory, time, empathy, technology, and action, before ending with a short show reel with sound. So our projects specifically question the influence of cinema and video games on architecture. For instance, Fictional Constructs proposes a new architectural vocabulary which appropriates cinematographic techniques such as the frame, the shot, and montage. The site is Kraftwerk, a former industrial power station located in the center of Berlin. The project combines Deleuze's taxonomy of cinema and Semper's notion of the knot and the joint into a new understanding of montage as a compositional, generative architectonic device. The film establishes a seamless hyperreal fantasy world and uses techniques such as anamorphism, kinetic animation, slow motion, and vertigo to propose a series of design interventions that create deception of scale, time, and place. Inspired by Tom Anderson's Los Angeles Plays itself, the design proposes an open film studio that constantly evolves, grows, and performs, acts, and expands, merging the boundaries between the everyday and the iconic. The real city blurs into its representation in film. By adding the dimension of time, we rethink the ways in which we draw. Agitprop pictures social and political conflict in urban public spaces through an animation that translates cinematic montage into architectural drawing. Inspired by Verto's ideas of bringing together fragments of cities through film, the project claims as a site the fabricated convergence of 3 geographically distinct places. It draws together 3 European squares: Syntagma Square in Athens, Trafalgar Square in London, and the public space in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. The squares are major touristic destinations in their respective cities, but also political epicenters where people gather to protest. The film traces the design and production of a dialectic structure, a modern Tower of Babel, constructing from the clash of cultural icons to incite strong emotional associations through a process of superimposition and superadjacency. In 2014, before the Brexit result, Agitprop's use of cinematic montage as the art of conflict was perhaps prescient, a rhetorical architecture able to foresee the future. Through drawing with film, we also create philosophical or political architectural allegories. Located within the industrial hinterlands of the city of Leicester, Weaving the Ineffable imagines a library embedded within mysterious and bleak microcosmos of Soar Island. This shifting labyrinthine terrain is loosely traced out across the island, guided by the writings of Borges, Eco, and Deleuze. Complex interconnecting networks of rooms lure the visitor to endlessly explore the depths of the apparently boundaryless interior. In this allegorical architecture, inspired by philosophy and literature, the long linear edifice echoes the structures of the mind. With A Debt to René's essay film about the library, the project studies different types of path to knowledge. It never had an orthographic plan. Instead, designed through digital film and inspired by video games, it was meant to multiply and grow as you move around it. Through the use of film, we often propose novel architectural typologies with a surprising attitude towards time. An anatomical embassy designs the duration of the refurbishment of the Embassy of Japan in Piccadilly and imagines its temporary relocation into the north edge of the adjacent Green Park. The procedural, operational, and diplomatic organs of the embassy become ceremonially eviscerated from the Victorian body and spill out into the park, like scattered seeds, which grow into small pavilion-like interventions. These vessels become reinserted in the original building after a period of open use in the park. The 2 identities and 2 sets of vocabularies of the 2 nations eventually grafting and budding together. This dual empathy, that of Green Park and that of 101 to 104 Piccadilly, embodies Venturi's ideas of duality, fragments, individuals, inflections, and the whole. It becomes a carefully considered diplomatic architecture of formality and negotiation. The final film's poetic voiceover and an imaginary character called Anderson strongly references the phonotope as observed in Patrick Hilder's films. The essay film's strong trait of subjectivity imbues a sense of empathy, where the architect-filmmaker identifies with a building. Named after the institute established by Stuart Brand and Brian Eno, the Long Now Foundation is guided by an interest in instilling long-term thinking. The building and the film is the result of a pilgrimage route along the Thames from the sea to the source, during which a brick is made from the river's clay. Once fired, the brick is ceremonially carried along the river, and on the 9th day, it is placed at the source as a monad for a temple projected to grow over the next 10,000 years. Rules derived from the structure of bismuth crystals guide the placement of the bricks, and the labyrinthine architecture that emerges of this huge expanse of time is the result of the pilgrim's interpretation and improvisation, forming a ruin in reverse. Indebted to Marquez Saint-Soleil, the Long Now Foundation is a proposal situated between land art and essay film that questions the role of time in architecture, as well as the role of the architect as author. Other films give voice to the building and allow it to become alive through digital projection techniques. Waite's House, a film about the building housing the Bartlett School of Architecture, which in 2014 was due for partial demolition and refurbishment. Deriving from the memories of its inhabitants through an extensive process of interviews with staff and students and realized through digital technology, the building plays itself on its own skin. Using projection mapping, the film merges the real and the imagined to create a new spatial construct, a third space. A deeply personal and reflective narration runs throughout, revealing the multifarious, sometimes hilarious, and often precarious relationships we maintain with our built environment, which after a while we realize comes from the building itself. The film calls for a more holistic approach to architectural design that incorporates and celebrates notions of death and decay. Vendors talking buildings, and the work of living architectures was clearly a reference here. Finally, the use of new digital technologies in film not only pushes the boundaries of what film is, but becomes a vehicle for politically engaged action in Hannah Arendt's definition of the term. Established between London, Athens, and Lesbos Island in December 2015, the Embassy for the Displaced is a design-based collective that operates both in the field and remotely, providing spontaneous responses to those embroiled in the refugee crisis. A No Borders backpack made from discarded boats and life jackets was assembled to alleviate the immediate needs of those arriving on the island. Following this, a series of carefully curated LIDAR scans formed the basis of an immersive film, conveying the real-time plight of desperation to the wider world. The Embassy for the Displaced serves as a design for survival laboratory, a visual archive of the refugees' journey, and an institution on the side of the displaced, a land for the landless. By questioning new image-making technologies and the way they can be used to shape public perception, the project closely references Harem Farocki's work. So, in lieu of a conclusion, I would like to end with a showreel with sound, a short showreel with sound, which I believe is one of the most important but also forgotten dimensions that film is able to reveal in architecture.
One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
I was struck by the vulnerability of the embassy in the same way as I'm struck by how ideas of the home and the other are produced in this vulnerability.
I long for more space. I long to be able to stretch out like I used to. People are so secretive, huddled together in their studios. But I want to open up.
Welcome to the Grand Budapest Hotel.
Six, you go.
Hold that lift.
Caution, continued collision may affect narrative progress.
It's a cartoon of country living and a cartoon of a house. So it has none of the amenities of country life. It has none of the amenities of the town. And in fact, it has all the disadvantages of both. You know, all you really have is a 6-lane highway.
This is a chapter in the epic of America called Arizona, the land of sunshine and blue sky.
The steel super frame allows the master plan to be completely flexible. We have spent many years refining the design of the single-skinned inflatable structure. And naturally, we encountered many setbacks during the early stages.
Lesbos, Europa. بيقولوا إنه كل شخطورة هون. كل سترة وقاية. قصة نجاة.
Henry was a renegade, never liked to play it safe. One component at a time, there's got to be a better way.
As solitaire's the only game in town.
I can remember.
A common factor that brings is in all three of your presentations. One might be artifice. Another might be the mobility and the depth of space. And a third might be something like the problems of matching individual visions to technological vision. Richard, in your presentation, you had that rather nice silhouette figure moving around in front of the picture and in some sense in the picture, and dealing with the problem of the frame, which sometimes seems an advantage and sometimes seems a curse, that people want to expand it so that it matches the almost 180-degree vision of the eye. In your talk, I was very struck by the way that you introduced lighting suddenly, which transforms the white studio into the black studio, as it were. One thing, however, a question that arose to me was that whereas the early studios you showed were, in a sense, little theatre stages with a camera in front. Now, at some point, cameras themselves began to move. They had moved very, very early in documentary films, like the Phantom Ride films, very early on, Lumiere and others. But at what point did the camera move into the set and negotiate the set? And then, Penelope, in your students' presentations, the camera never stopped moving. It was perpetually orbiting through and around. It's wonderful virtuosity about this. However, it raises a question of whether it's too much of a good thing, because it doesn't necessarily look like human movement. It's some kind of extraterrestrial movement. And one worry I have about digital filmmaking is that it's humanly unrealistic. Let me give you an example. In the beginning of Vertigo, you see a race across the roofs, and somebody fails to make that and falls, and then Jimmy Stewart almost fails to make it. Now, that's because we know that a human being can jump from about that distance. I'm rather kind of suspicious of all those digital games where people jump enormous distances and walk up walls and things. And at that point, I think, well, how can that possibly be a guide to architecture? Because people don't walk up walls, except in outer space, like in the Gravity film. So those are just some themes that came into my head.
Wide array. Shall I start? What pops in my head? I think obviously film has a very important function for me as an architect and a designer, and as a design educator to make people understand a little bit of the importance of scale and texture and light and sort of quality of space. I mean, with the presentation that I gave, I was, in a sense, questioning a little bit about our relationship to the screen a little bit, and the expectations we have as consumers, but also the expectations we must have as filmmakers today, how our moving image products are being consumed. And while the Lumiere Brothers were, and Gilliam and Scorsese were very unsatisfied with the two-dimensional, relatively small screen that they thought that they would have for their projections, and the sort of flatness of the surface. They went to enormous lengths to enlarge the image and to make it more immersive. Today, if I go to take a tube or something like this, you have plenty of people watching their movies, on mobile phones. So I'm just really struck what's happening here. Are we simply not, do we not value the size of the screen, or does it really not matter? So if it doesn't matter, what is it that matters? I mean, having worked with a lot of filmmakers who are very precise about as well when we show their films for us as to how we need to project them, from the print, and if not from the print, if it's digital, then it has to be done in a very precise way that the audience has the absolute maximum ability to receive what they intended to do with the film. Most of these things seem to be blown out of the window when we watch a Netflix series today on a mobile phone. So what is it that that draws us into the story? What is the importance, and what sort of lessons do we need to take on board from that as filmmakers and potential as architects? And now I'm going to make a quantum leap here, which is, what is the consequence of all of this for us as people that are interested in urban space? I mean, if I'm looking at my screen, do buildings matter? Yeah. Do other people still matter? Because my story world is somewhere else. So I confused everybody now, but that's my little contribution to this sort of the discussions around screen and space that I try to draw attention to. But
one bit of your question is very easy to answer, which is when did the camera start to move? As far as we know, the first moving camera that any people noticed that we're aware of actually happened during one of the big Italian spectacle films that I was talking about, Cabiria. In Cabiria, which was the most spectacular of these films in 1914, 1915, they mounted the camera on rollers, and it rolls forward into this extraordinary set with Moloch consuming children in the background. And it was known as a Cabiria shot. And filmmakers quickly picked up on this and realized that the advancing camera, the slowly advancing camera, had got fantastic potential to reveal space, create space, involve audiences and so forth. And so it kind of entered the technology of filmmaking. But I'm interested in the frame question a lot. Again, another historical footnote, but an interesting one. A filmmaker that I've spent a lot of time with and on, Michael Powell. A little noticed feature of Powell's career in the mid-1940s, he was interested in two really innovative ideas which didn't go anywhere. One was the idea of the virtual studio, and he actually chaired a research group for the Rank organization in the greater use of back projection and all sorts of techniques like that to make films entirely in the studio. And the other filmmakers hated it so much that it was kind of quietly shelved. This whole idea of it was called independent frame. Some people may have heard of it, the Independent Frame Project. It was partly a cost-cutting thing, but it was also a kind of visionary idea, headed by an art director, a production designer called David Rawnsley. And Michael was very wedded to it. But he was also interested, and I discovered this once interviewing him, in the idea that the edge of the screen shouldn't be a sharp edge, but it should just merge into the auditorium. And he even had an idea about photoelectric cells that would fringe the screen and extend the picture outwards. And this is at the same time that he made the red shoes. So that kind of didn't go anywhere because the technology obviously wasn't there. But he asked himself, why should films have to have this sharp edge at a time when they always did have a sharp edge because of the tabs that were used in cinemas? And just, if I can try just one.
I think that is. I find that very important with relation to architecture, and I discovered it painfully with a personal experience with my first video camera. I was visiting Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and I walked in and said, wow, it's still get the camera out. And of course, actually, it's sort of like that. And I thought, oh, I see, I've got to go like that to get the span of the dome. So then I put a fisheye on. Well, that was no good either, because everybody looked like a bubble, and it's odd that it seems a bit of a glitch in the relation between architecture and film, in that even CinemaScope cameras and wide angle are still fairly narrow. And that quality of ambience, of walking into and through a space, is actually quite hard, I think, to get right, because it very rapidly turns into a kind of fly-through virtuosity. What do you think, Penelope?
Yeah, I think this is a quite important conversation. I think that there are, in a way, we might think of the frame as perhaps a limiting device, which was not necessarily always there. And I see it as coinciding with the invention of perspective, for instance, in the Renaissance, which was a misreading of ancient Greek understanding of vision. In ancient Greece, they understood it in angles, but not in terms of planes. What the Renaissance added is this idea of the plane, and I think that this has then influenced deeply both architecture, but also image making, resulting with cinema as well. The photographic idea of space, of representation of space, is based on that single plane. And I think that one of the most amazing things with working with film in the unit is this opportunity of building up a three-dimensional construct in which you can enter as not a body, but as a kind of still monocular eye. At the same time, I was very interested in what you were describing about immersive technologies, and we have students actually that are actually now jumping into this kind of next stage of the immersive technology, AR and VR, and creating these worlds that perhaps relate more with the world of dreams, because as you say, like when we're in a space, we're bound by gravity and by our own existing body into being able to view a space through a very specific point of view. But in our dreams, I think we have the opportunity of encompassing that world. No frames and no necessarily bound body conditions. So maybe this kind of dreamlike quality is something that maybe comes in the camera work that you were describing there, and which in cinema, I must admit that I find in current cinema has been pushed to the limit as well. Like we have this kind of complete incredulous positions in space, and you described vertigo, but if you have seen any action movie recently, the things that happen there are by no means bound to any possible gravitational realities and jump into that world. Not that it's a necessarily positive move, but I think that there is something about this boundaries that are set through technologies and through cultures of looking that shape our imagination and shape the ways that we then can imagine space.
Production designers rely on the framing quite a lot because they want to know what is in the frame, what's not in the frame. And the framing is, you know, perspective framings and stuff like that, and MUT and other technologies to superimpose and to compose images within the shoot. So
but that's changing. I mean, they've always had to do that, and it's interesting that the route that production designers always followed, the profession is built on people who train as architects. Absolutely, literally. So every production designer, I think almost without exception, had trained as an architect before they moved into cinema. John Box, the man that I got to know really well, had trained as an architect, then went to cinema. That's starting to change because the tools you use today of, you know, super versions of CAD, as it were, aren't necessarily the tools of architecture. I mean, they can be, they're shared with architecture, but they're not the same tools. And so what the production designers of the future will need to have as training is a very interesting question.
Well, this brings me to a slightly sore point, because I had hoped around about now to show a kind of little video that a friend at John Moore's was preparing, but he couldn't finish it because I would bring it here. What I asked him to do was to try to produce a short visual history of the parallel development, intertwined development of CGI on one hand, computer-generated imagery in movies, and CAD, computer-assisted design in architecture on the other. And is there a, you know, we need a historian here, because it's not been done as far as I know.
No, I don't. There's not an overview of it. Everyone has a feel about it, an intuition, depending where you are in this sort of area. But I don't think there's an overview yet, because it's very difficult to work in these areas. I mean, just to come back to a point that you made a moment ago about, you know, the camera. Where is the camera? The impossible camera. I've just edited a book. It's coming out in a couple of months. There's a piece in it which I think is really good by Roger Audin, French film and media theorist, in which he talks about the. He points out that what we now do with our mobile camera phones goes completely beyond traditional film grammar, and we shouldn't even use the same terminology, because it's completely different. And he describes a simple sequence of someone arrives at a door with their camera on in Skype, and they're sending a live image to somebody on the other side of the world, and they're touring around. If you describe that in old-fashioned cinematic language, you're actually not describing what's really happening because of the real-time aspect of it being in communication. And I think it's a terrific description of the kind of challenge that faces us to really understand what we now do as a matter of habit on a daily basis. We're still stuck with an old-fashioned apparatus of cinema with all its formal ways of describing things, and what we actually do with these things that we carry around in our pockets.
Well, I think that back in the 70s, when video first appeared, there was a sort of utopian moment, wasn't there? I think that quite a lot of, my friend Dan Graham, an American artist, was involved in this somewhat in the 70s. The idea that you could take control of the camera yourself and that you were sending as well as receiving, the whole thing wasn't a center-to-periphery diffusion system, which was Donald Shon's term for an obsolete social organization in I think it's 1970 Reed's lectures. And I remember Cedric Price saying, we're moving from an episcopal to a congregational system of media. In other words, it won't be bishops and popes handing down. We'll all be doing it ourselves. It's this two-way interaction or multi-way interaction that seems to be important. At which point I think is a cue to bring in the audience as any
participants.
Yeah. Renee.
Well, first of all, thank you for all three amazing presentations, which have made me think about many, many things. But my question really is for Penelope and for Richard. Just to pick up on some things that you said, because just now you talked about...
We've got a roving microphone, sorry.
Just now you talked about what you said as making urban spaces. Because as an architectural educator, my interest is also helping people to make better buildings, better places, better cities. And you talked about, are we the actor or the spectator? And that goes back to Penelope, the architectural essay film. Hopefully, in this work, it helps the student, the architectural student, as well as everyone else, to understand the world that we create for ourselves. And some of the pieces that you showed had totally different temporal and also evocative dissonance. The walking through the piles of refugee, like the life vests, is huge and one that we can all relate to and understand. And then the earlier one, can't remember what it was called, with the sort of things swirling in space and, you know. How this, and this is for both of you, as really about your opinion, how do they help us to create or design or perceive or understand the cities that we occupy? Or are they a reflection of our feelings about them? In what role can film help support us as designers? It's a very open question.
Yeah. I mean, it's a journey, it's a discovery on all of those questions that you ask, which are the right questions to be asked, certainly for architects and designers. I would principally agree with De Soto and Merleau-Ponty that we create space, our being in space. I think we should be actors. We are creators of space. I'm also one of those very weird architects who believe that architecture in itself is quite meaningless. I'm usually bored by a lot of buildings because they're just objects in space. I don't care much about it. To me, architecture comes to life if you put people in it. I would call them protagonists from a film perspective. So that's sort of my basic position. I think with regards to film, I think you can obviously look at film from a different point of view. First of all, you could see film, as we have done for many years, as a reflective tool. Yeah, you sort of, I don't know, you watch film and you engage in the spatial qualities of films, but you focus on the representation of the things that you see in the film and how we bring this back into architectural design and practice. It certainly happens, but it probably happens through the back door. The other thing is, which I am interested in, is the sort of democratization of filmmaking through things like the mobile phone, which suddenly allow us to frame our places and spaces and our emotions, our impressions, and share those impressions with a lot of people around the world by unprecedented instantaneous means in a quite effective way. And those sharing of moving images and creations of space or films shape our understanding of space. So this is obviously, you all know that my reading of New York is very much tainted by Scorsese and many other films in New York. So I think we actively engaging, capturing but also sharing moving images, interpreting space through the camera is a contribution to place making, and to me what really place is.
And I mean, many different ways that I think that the work that the students do in Unit 24 is significant for placemaking. One has to do with the projects are usually speculative, so they might be creating fictional constructs. So they might not necessarily tie to an existing reality, and they go on flights of imagination or exaggerate conditions. At the same time, I think that what we're mostly interested in is a sensitivity to dimensions that through the traditional means of designing space are not possible to reflect on. So the plan in the section doesn't allow us to enter into things that, as you described, have to do with tone or mood or atmosphere, which are dimensions that the students are really interested in, and they might exaggerate it, but it makes them think through those terms. And this is not something new. Like, for instance, going back again in history, the word rhythm, rhythmos, was something that was describing both music but also architecture. What we call now order in ancient Greek is the same word, rhythmos. So the Corinthian, Dorian and Ionic orders are called rhythmi, rhythms, and there was a correlation between the mood of each with the type of architecture, but also with the type of sensibility. So these sensibilities that the space and music can convey is something that I believe we have forgotten in terms of how we approach architecture. And I think that it's something that through making films, for instance, as an example, but there are others as well, like weathering, assembly process, that come across, which is quite difficult to describe in a plan and a section, a static drawing. But there is another dimension which we're also interested in, and goes back to the kind of new technologies, the democratization, but also the kind of different immersive technologies that are superimposed on our real space, and that we can't really necessarily any longer consider real space as independent of these technologies, and that there might be need architecture design within that realm, which might have a kind of dreamlike dimension, and we need to consider, and we need to start thinking about this on the imaginary level, which also was always part of architecture. A dome is not just a structural construct. It's a way of framing an imaginative construct, which has to do with understanding of the sky, or even understanding of visual processes. So it's a kind of projection of an imaginary construct as much as a structural construct. So these are the ways that I feel that these explorations are valid and useful.
Brian's Hagia Sophia problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hagia Sophia exceeds the possibility of being captured in a portable way, as domes do.
In a flat plane.
Yeah. I very much agree with what you said. I'll just add this to discussion because it's sort of, I think it has to be said. I mean, the work that I do up in Liverpool, working a lot with augmented realities. I mean, we are entering a time where we'll take for granted that our physical space is also being populated with digital information. And we're at the beginning of this, and I think we are beginning to see some very interesting examples. Not all these things, hopefully, in the future will be played out via games, but actually could be used in meaningful ways. I'm certainly trying to do that with my practice. And I think that is, what the near future will bring. So the separation between the medium of moving images and physical space will probably dissolve a little bit, and will certainly blur the boundaries, and it will be more commonly accepted that we have a layered space of a physical and the digital.
I would have thought, though, that convergence tends to happen more in certain places than others. For instance, when one boards a powered vehicle, whether it's a train, a car, or a rocket, I think one approaches more quickly the state that you're describing compared to, let's say, a familiar way of just simply lounging around and walking around humanly familiar places and spaces. And I'm a little concerned about that getting a bit lost somehow. It's a sort of phenomenological imminence that certain films have been wonderful at registering in fiction films, but which in the studios I'm not seeing coming out of CGI or CAD so much.
A lot of fiction narrative is based on the idea of mixing the familiar with the unfamiliar, and I think I agree with your imagination and imaginative spaces. We certainly do that. We use familiar places and we'll add things to them which surprise us, which draw us into a narrative. I probably should demonstrate this somehow.
I mean, there's also what you might call the aspect of what we call plausible conduct and behavior on the part of protagonists. That if you make a fantastic film, there's an expectation that the people will be behaving in some fantastic way. Now, I'm simply, I'm kind of being a bit sort of curmudgeonly here, because I'm saying, well, look, you've been training to be an architect, you're training for human beings to live in these buildings, not robots, not aliens, nothing else, We have two legs and so on. Therefore, what I admire in great filmmaking is very often, and from an architectural point of view, it shows me how human beings can and have dealt with and created by their actions the spaces around them. And I'm kind of a little bit twitchy about seeing things whizzing around the whole time. The only time that I felt myself and that kind of three-dimension multi-orbital motion really seemed credible and true to me was when I saw Gravity, because that takes place in outer space. There's no up, there's no down, there's no sideways. Things don't slow down because of atmospheric pressure. They continue to travel at thousands of miles an hour in a vacuum, and so on, and you really can float and fly. And at that point, physical reality corresponds to digital possibility.
In the sense that the first time, I think it's a very interesting question. The first time that the big close-up appeared in cinema, people, which were the most cultured people, found that unacceptable and totally unnatural. I find, it's not inhabitual to see in film some top shots, and again, suddenly, although we follow a character, we can identify with that. We can understand that. What I find interesting is that somehow, with film, we can perhaps look at architecture in a different way and use these escape our condition, sort of a physical condition, in order to see possibilities, to break boundaries. And I find it sort of, although uncomfortable, also at the same time interesting. I think that, isn't it the way that we should embrace the new possibilities, rather than but I understand that within fiction, of course, film is so let's say there's so many layers to films, so many type of films. If we are talking of narrative films, or let's say fiction films, here we're talking of film essays, which tend to be at the same time acknowledging narrative, but trying to distance themselves from narratives. And it's all this notion that we're fighting with. Somehow what we're discovering today is that the subject is really, really big and is multifaceted. Architects can be interested in looking at films to see what, suddenly that they reveal the sound space that we can't explore in other ways. They can also be interested in film to actually produce architecture, and that's a completely different way to approach it. I don't know if I think that somehow what we're struggling here is that it's very difficult to define or to focus on a particular path, because somehow we are facing lots of possibilities for architecture.
Thanks. Well, that is rather the purpose of the day, because I was aware that this is a multifaceted field, and actually quite primitively developed at present in many respects. However, it's also lunchtime, and I'm aware that some stomachs will be grumbling. I think some of the topics will be taken up further this afternoon, and we will begin. I've forgotten where's the song sheet? Theoretically tabulated here. Where are we? Yes, 12:50 lunch. We're already late for that. Okay, so we're supposed to begin at 13:40. And the speakers, we have lunch in, I hope this time we've got the room. And hope to see you soon. And we'll begin with Francois this afternoon. Thank you.